So let's go on and get started.
Oh,
Bernie joined us, which means their session finally ended.
Yes, it did.
So welcome everybody, those who are here, and I'm sure we're going to get more people. So what this, this is the session on NEPA at 50 years, the National Environmental Policy Act. And I think that our goals for today are to talk about how important NEPA is to communities and agencies, and also how people have used the act to impact issues that affect communities, environmental justice communities, and talk about some of the recent changes and what effects those have, may have, will have on the way we need to be doing business, okay? And we're gonna open it up. If you have questions, please put it in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll be happy, we'll save time for that. And by the end of this, we hope that you walk away with a deeper understanding of the importance of NEPA and some recommendations about what we can do to strengthen it when we get our new administration, which we're gonna get in a few weeks in November. I'm just saying. So I'm going to introduce quickly everybody, but I'm gonna let them talk. I should say who I am. I am Adrienne Hollis. I am the senior climate change and health scientist at the Union of Concerned Scientists. I've been there almost 2 years. I'm an environmental toxicologist and environmental attorney. I work on environmental justice issues. I've been doing it since my infancy, which is why I'm so young and yet still a senior scientist. Don't type anything bad, Bernice. And I fight with communities. I'm an advocate and an activist for environmental justice for those who are who have traditionally been lacking a voice, but who have their own voice and help to provide opportunity for that. So without further ado, we actually have Cynthia Peurifoy and Kathy Egland here, and we have two more speakers who are not here yet. Schima from Earthjustice and Seema, I'm going to mispronounce her name, Kakade from University of Maryland's Environmental Law Clinic. So while we're waiting for them to arrive, we're going to introduce, start with Kathy, and I'm going to give a brief introduction and she'll tell us a little bit more in a few minutes. So Kathy is on the National Board of Directors of the NAACP. And for those who don't know, that's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And she was elected in 1998. And she's served as chair of the board's Environmental and Climate Justice Committee since the ECJ program was established in 2010. She is also the co-founder of Education, Economics, Environment, Climate, and Health, an organization called EEECHO. I hope I pronounced that right. EECHO, and it's a grassroots coalition that addresses the unique environmental and climate challenges confronting vulnerable residents within the Gulf. Now, I have to say this, I was gonna leave it to Kathy, but I've got to say that Kathy has represented both the NAACP and EECHO at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, right? The COP. And the first one was that she's been there for 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, which was the last one last December in Madrid, Spain. I haven't been to any, but I mean, I've been wanting to go. So maybe Kathy, I'm putting a word here, I would like to go to these places. So that's a little bit about Miss Katherine Egland, who I hope I can call Kathy. Next, we have Miss Cynthia Peurifoy, and Cynthia is retired from the US EPA, but I use that term loosely because she's probably working harder than she did when she was at EPA, as most people do. I don't know why they consider themselves to be retired, but apparently 2 years ago, with over 40 years of service. And she was the Regional Environmental Justice Program Manager and Coordinator at EPA Region 4 in Atlanta. We love, 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 love Cynthia, love Kathy, we love all our speakers. But anyway, I worked with Region 4 folks when I was at ATSDR, so special relationship there. So Cynthia has built lasting relationships, that is so true, with many EJ stakeholders in Region 4. And actually, I'm gonna add outside of Region 4 also. and has worked to create an atmosphere of engagement, respect, and collaboration around EJ issues in the region. So let me look. Okay, so that's where we are. So I'm going to start with you, Cynthia. Can you just give us a brief overview of the National Environmental Policy Act? You know, we know that it includes passages that for the first time allowed the public to participate in government decision-making, but can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Okay. Well, can I tell it to you from my perspective?
Yes, and I see Stephen has joined, so he can add what you know when you finish.
So he'll do that part. You want me to go ahead?
No, go on, Cynthia.
Yeah, because I wanted to talk about it from a little historical perspective. And here in the region, so many years ago, all of the communities that I started working with, I was a Superfund Community Involvement Coordinator. And most of the communities I worked with initially were in South Carolina. So that included a lot of communities in Charleston and even going down to Savannah, Riverside, and places like that. And one of the things that we learned very early on was it wasn't just our Superfund site that was an issue to the community. It was all the other things that were happening in that community. And what I mean by that is a lot of the federal projects that were going on at the time. Charleston had a naval base. They were going through a lot of transition. The mayor there was working very closely with the community. Congressman Clyburn was very active because when you go into these communities, you really get to see what environmental justice is all about, because you see these road projects going all through the communities. Nobody was really having a lot of input in terms of what was going on. And so we really started working more collectively with the federal agencies, and that's when we started really getting an understanding of NEPA. What we learned was that, you know, these things were happening, but the communities weren't really having a voice in what was happening. So I think part of what we did when we were in a lot of these communities was we brought everybody in and did a lot of other things and did a lot of community capacity building. And I think back to the late 2000s when we started the community-based environmental protection project up in Charleston, North Charleston, South Carolina, working very closely with, again, like I said, the community. We had every neighborhood president. We worked with the city of Charleston and North Charleston, and that's when we really began to build those relationships towards understanding what was happening, having the community really have some impacts. There was so much going on. We were doing our site, which really led to a lot of other things. But in the meantime, you got a road coming in, you've got a bridge coming in, you've got the naval base going through all these changes, you're going through redevelopment, and nobody was really paying attention to how that all fit together. But once we started a lot of the work and bringing all the other federal agencies in, that's when we really got to have some concrete things that the community had a seat at the table. They were really able to slow some things down. They were really able to start getting mitigation plans on the way. So that's when I think about NEPA and how NEPA was. I think a lot of things weren't going right, but when communities got a chance to really understand what was happening and how they could impact it and how they could work with their local governments and the federal agencies to work together, things would happen a lot. I also think back, and Dr. McLean talked about this a little bit the other day, the Savannah River site. You know, there were so many issues associated with the Savannah River site. But through working with DOE, working with EPA, and really, again, empowering the community, that is a big part of all of it, is really empowering the community to be a part of the process and making sure they understand how to impact the process. That's kind of what my big thing about NEPA is really making sure communities know how to impact the process, be a part of the process, know that they have rights. I know that a lot of things are happening now. I see projects that at one point we thought we had made a lot of difference with, and I see them coming back again, you know, in another avenue, and things are happening. So it's very concerning to see the rollbacks that are taking place, and to see that some of these projects that we made so much progress on years ago, here they are coming back again at those communities.
Yeah. So we're going to thank you so much, Cynthia, and we're going to be talking about those specific incidents that you described in just a minute. Now, you threw out a lot of terms for some of the documents, which is perfectly great because it gives us an opportunity to go to Stephen to see if he could elaborate a little bit on NEPA. But before we do that, let me, Stephen, just do a quick introduction, and I would be able to do that if I could get my mouse to move, because, you know, the best laid plans and all of that. So Stephen is a senior legislative counsel, you guys, at Earthjustice. I love Earthjustice because the earth needs a good lawyer. He's a graduate of Lewis and Clark Law School. If you read I wrote a supplement to Bernice's article in the Environmental Law Institute's journal, and Stephen was one of the people that I focused on the work that he does and has done. For nearly 10 years, he's engaged in advocacy aimed at ensuring people were empowered to participate in major government decisions affecting their lives. And he's conducted workshops and trainings around the country to teach stakeholders how to engage in NEPA. And so we're going to leave some time at the end for everybody to give us a little more information that can help us as we, you know, try to get more into the NEPA process and actually where we fit in, right? Because you want to get in where you fit in. So Stephen, can you tell us some of the terminology stuff that we heard from Cynthia, and just, you know, give us an overview, because Cynthia laid it out great for us about how the community can become involved. So I'm inviting you to speak now. I think you're on mute. You're still muted. I don't know. Okay, there you are.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot. And yeah, I love talking about NEPA. This is what, like you're saying, I've been doing this for 10 years. And, you know, the real, you know, building off what Cynthia was saying, you know, NEPA really is a kind of mobilizing tool in a lot of cases. And I did have the good fortune of doing these workshops over the last 10 years where we get to, you know, talk about the process and empower people to use this process to get federal agencies to, you know, choose better outcomes that are better for communities. And I'm just going to give a real thumbnail sketch of what the NEPA process is, so we're all on the same page in terms of the language for some of the folks that aren't as familiar with the NEPA process. But generally, when I talk about NEPA, I like to, you know, remind people that, you know, this is possibly one of the most widely used laws that people are not aware of that they're actually using. People engage in the NEPA process without sometimes even realizing it. You know, you may go to a local meeting that's about a road being built or a bridge being built, and that meeting was because of NEPA. And, you know, the statute itself is really short and actually worth reading because it, you know, it talks about the right of people to a healthful environment and the responsibility of government to make decisions with an eye towards future generations. And this law was written 50 years ago. It's a really short statute. It's worth actually reading. I don't usually say that about a lot of laws because they can get kind of tedious really quick. But, you know, it's a well-written law with an eye towards the very issues that we're confronting right now. And, you know, the statute itself is short, but the regulations are where most of the meat of the law is, where we come to know of, you know, NEPA as we get involved with it. And, you know, there's a caveat here. I'm going to talk about this, and we're going to talk about it soon, shortly here. The regulations were recently changed. The Trump administration recently finalized a rule that will fundamentally change how this law operates. But the things that I'm going to talk about here are, you know, still in principle the same. So, as I talk about this, keep in mind what Cynthia was talking about, which is, the values that are embodied by NEPA. And, I like to speak of these values and principles because, this is really what the law is about. It's about the review of impacts, and it's not just environmental impacts. It's always important to keep that in mind because, even though it's the Environmental Policy Act, it actually requires the consideration of health impacts, of economic impacts, of cultural impacts, a whole host of impacts on communities. And it's not only the review of those impacts, but it's disclosure. This law requires disclosure of those impacts. It requires transparency. It's the sunshine law. And then most importantly, it requires meaningful public input. And that is why this law is so important. It's the people's voice. It is the most widespread mechanism for public involvement in federal decisions in the country. The law applies to over 85 agencies. Over 85 agencies have their own implementing regulations. And critically, this law also has accountability mechanisms so that you can hold the government accountable if they ignore any of these impacts or don't fail to disclose them or fail to give the public a meaningful opportunity to engage. So there's actually 3 types of review. And the first one is called a categorical exclusion, or CADEX, or CE, you might hear it called. And I think keep in mind that this is not an exclusion from review. This is actually one of 3 types of environmental review. And they're meant for activities that are truly will have a minimal impact or not a significant impact. And these are usually activities that are so routine that agencies know and have documented the activity won't have a significant impact. And, common examples are from the mundane, like minor facility renovations or installing new lighting in a building or trail maintenance or things like that. And it's something that we can maybe talk about later, but these can be prone to abuse because there is no opportunity for public input when a categorical exclusion is applied. And it's also important to note that categorical exclusions are pretty much, the predominant way that agencies comply with NEPA. 95% of actions that are subject to NEPA are processed through a categorical exclusion. But again, the idea is these are truly insignificant actions. But if there is a possibility that an action may have a significant impact on the human environment, then an agency does an environmental assessment. This is meant to be a concise document that simply determines whether or not there will be a significant impact. If there is not going to be a significant impact, the agency will issue a finding of no significant impact. It's called FOMSI. But if there is a determination that there's an impact, a significant impact, then they go on to the full-blown environmental impact statement. And this is what we get involved in. This is for truly significant actions that are going to have impacts. And this is where most people get involved. This is where there are several opportunities for public involvement at various stages of the development of the review. The agencies, identify the people or organizations that are going to be interested in this action, that will be affected by it. They identify the issues that are going to be analyzed, gaps in data and informational needs. And it goes through a draft stage and then a final stage, and then you have your final environmental impact statement. And, at Earthjustice, I was trying to think of a good example, and one of them that we've been involved with for the last several years is the Dakota Access Pipeline, which kind of illustrates all of these levels of review, how NEPA is used. The Dakota Access Pipeline, many people may be aware of it. It's been a flashpoint. It draws into stark relief these issues that we'll be talking about today. But, it's essentially, for those that aren't aware of it, it's a crude oil pipeline. It's put the water and sacred sites of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, who are a client in our litigation, in harm's way. The pipeline starts in North Dakota. It travels over 1,200 miles, carrying 600,000 gallons or barrels of oil a day across a third of the continent, and across a waterway that serves 17 million people. And originally, one of the alternative routes for this proposed pipeline was going to cross just north of Bismarck, North Dakota, which is, 92%, much more affluent. It's 92% white. There's more affluence in that area. And instead, the company decided they would be better to route it to the doorstep of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. And it's been a fight over justice, over sovereignty ever since. This has gone back and forth in the courts. It's gone back and forth in the agencies. The courts have found that the you know, there are serious problems with the environmental review. They've sent it back to the agency for further review. And just this summer, the court did the remarkable, they did a remarkable thing in issuing an injunction to stop the pipeline. They had to stop pumping oil through this pipeline, which is a huge, huge step forward in, you know, NEPA litigation. I mean, this is the power of NEPA. They can stop 600,000 barrels of oil being sent through this pipeline a day. And because it was failed to look at the actual risks of the pipeline. That injunction is on hold right now, and there's further litigation, but I use this as an example because it demonstrates the importance of NEPA with regard to environmental justice, and it puts all of these, you know, principles on display in terms of review of impacts. You need to look at the impacts on communities and on sacred sites, the cultural impacts. You have to have public input, and it was public input that actually, you know, changed the outcome of this process. And accountability, you know, NEPA, even though it is just a process and people sometimes get dispirited that it doesn't require a certain outcome, it does require agencies to look at these impacts, and if they ignore them, they cannot move forward. And that is why NEPA is such a critical tool. And it's helped turn an ordinary pipeline case into a movement. And, you know, this is why NEPA and the changes that were enacted recently are so important to pay attention to, because it is a powerful law, and what happens in the next several months will, you know, determine how we can get involved in government decisions over the next generation.
Adrienne, you're muted.
Oh, can you hear me?
Oh my God, I was making such a wonderful statement. I said, thank you, Stephen. And that was a great introduction. We're going to be talking about some of those changes later and what impacts they may have. And that I was thanking both you and Cynthia for such a great introduction and leeway into that. I want to take a moment to welcome our fourth panelist, Seema. Seema, I'm going to mispronounce your last name, so I apologize in advance. Unless you just want to tell me what it is.
No problem, no problem. Seema Kakade.
Kakade, that's what I said earlier. Okay, great. So I'm going to introduce Seema in a few minutes, and we're going to hear from her. But first, I kind of wanted to hear from Ms. Egland, from Kathy Egland, about telling us a little bit about how you use, or how you've used NEPA in the work that you've done, and which of the three categories that Stephen just told us about would you consider to be the most important? And you have to unmute.
Okay, I couldn't tell you which of the three was most important. That would be like asking me to choose my favorite child. So
Okay.
I think they're all important. And I think when we look, you know, first of all, let me say, when we look at NEPA and we look at its passage, which was, you know, it passed unanimously in the Senate 50 years ago. And so when we look at that and the margin, that whopping margin that won in the House of Representatives, it would be great if we had that type of insight and that type of bipartisanship today when we're looking at environmental injustices. But we did, and the good thing is, in looking at, it's kind of disheartening a lot of times to see what's happening, because a lot of our laws and acts are becoming unraveled in recent years, and they have fell victim to economic advancement and job opportunities. And that's always what we get. And just let me say that I feel like we always find ourselves up against each and every day ways of people being able to get around these laws and trying to protect them and not doing what the law was intended to do. And we recently, again, I don't know how many of you know, some of you have heard about the story of Turkey Creek. So if you've never seen the documentary, Come Hell or High Water, the story of Turkey Creek, it would be interesting to watch that documentary. But the challenges facing the African-American communities of Turkey Creek and Forest Heights and the larger North Gulfport area in Mississippi are reflective of actually what's happening all across America. It's a struggle every single day for our local communities to fend off harmful proposals. And these struggles have gone from generation to generation. I heard Cynthia saying she's seen these projects come back again, and that's the most unfortunate thing. We have a development that was proposed over almost two decades ago by a developer, and which would have destroyed almost 600 acres of wetlands and would have presented tremendous obstacles and problems for the Turkey Creek and North Gulfport community. And the mayor at that time, because the residents were so vociferously opposed to that development, and the mayor, in front of the media, in a media interview, called the residents a bunch of dumb bastards. And that was the headline of the newspaper. And for that to be a headline in the South Mississippi Bible Belt newspaper, it is, you know, quite an understatement. And so that proposal was eventually defeated thanks to the NAACP and the Sierra Club, but not before the vindictive mayor went out into the Turkey Creek under the guise of desnagging the creek and totally wrecked the area. He desecrated grave sites, and this is a historical community in that it was founded by a group of emancipated people who had been enslaved. So, you know, and now that was 20 years ago, and as soon as they think you're not looking, here comes another proposal that we found now that, you know, kind of they tried to slip in under the wire during COVID, and that there has been a proposal where now the current mayor, who is a lot more savvy, and the son of the original developer, who are back at the very same thing again, to where they're coming up with this proposal, and they always they you know, they get a little savvier each time they bring these proposals. And this time it was like a 30-page proposal where they are proposing, this is just going to be the beginning of the project. They are proposing to have a connector road from the Gulfport Airport, and this is going to go into a shopping mall. And that shopping mall, of course, is connected to this property that they tried to develop a few years ago. And the son of the developer, because the original owner of the property is deceased, his father is deceased, and he is, quote unquote, donating $5 million worth of land for this project, you know. And it's almost, it is, you know, if it were not so serious for the residents who would be adversely impacted, because this is a residential area that has been exposed to a tremendous amount of flooding, especially after Hurricane Katrina. Because after Hurricane Katrina, a lot of the development moved north of the city, away from the beachfront. And it has exacerbated flooding in that area. And so this development, once we saw it, we only had, you know, very little amount of time to really get out there and try and get this stopped, because they kind of held it close to the vest for quite some time. And then they had this public meeting. So we had to do as much as we can. And I think a lot of people are just, as Fannie Lou Hamer said, sick and tired of being sick and tired of. Every time you look up, Cynthia, it's like over and over again, we're fighting these same battles. They come to us in one form or another. And they even alluded in the proposal that this connector road would be able to lead to more economic opportunities. And we know what that means is that original development that started 20 years ago, where the developer's son, who now owns the company and runs the company, will have donated this land, and this will be nothing more than to fast track what they were trying to do 20 years ago. And this will adversely impact the Forest Heights community, which is another historical community. So we're not talking about just places of residence. We're talking about pieces of history that are destroyed when this happened. The Forest Heights community was a first of its kind HUD project. It was a joint venture between HUD, the National Council of Negro Women, and it was supported by the Ford Foundation. So when you get into these, and I moved to Gulfport from Hattiesburg, so I didn't know about the history, but when I'll never forget when I first met former HUD Secretary Jack Kemp. He was running for vice president, and we had to introduce ourselves and say where we were from. And when I said I was from Gulfport, Mississippi, he grabbed his heart and he said, Forest Heights Turnkey. And that was the name of the project, what they call Turnkey Project, because it was a first of its kind and the first integrated housing development in the nation. It has since evolved into a almost exclusively African-American community. And the odd thing is, I actually met Dr. Dorothy Heights a few months after then, and the exact same thing happened. And then for the next hour or so, she pulled me aside to talk to me about that development. That was her crowning glory. That was part of her legacy. And you don't destroy places and pieces of history like this. Dr. Height was a Congressional Medal recipient. And when you talk about, when people start talking about buyouts and all of that, that's something, you don't leave pieces of history like that. So we are not only looking into trying to get Turkey Creek on the National Historical Register, because it was built 52 years ago, but we reached out at the time. We said, okay, we need to really make sure that we're not doing this 10 years from now and 20 years from now. So we're going to go all out in our efforts. And so in our objections, we quoted the NEPA, and we sent copies to everyone from the Office of Civil Rights. And that's the approach that we're going to have to take from here on out. Rather than just trying to defeat this a little at a time, we need to, and actually really and truly, these acts are being watered down when we really need to be, we're at a time where we need to be beefing them up. We need to be making requirements. In the original parts of the act, it was mandated that you would have environmental impact studies. Now the trend is just to do environmental assessments. And that's the first thing they'll say, oh, we followed the law, we did environmental assessment. And if they do that, but mostly what you're looking at are people who are just willing to do the bare minimum. Also, and there are 4 things that we're facing. That's one. Another one is the restoration of Turkey Creek with Restore Act funding. Now, when you talk about restoring wetlands, that's a good thing ordinarily. And it all sounds great. But when you do this, and you know that there is a community adjacent to Turkey Creek that has experienced some type of flooding, the very first thing, the human thing you would think, the most just thing you would do would be to do a flood risk assessment. Sometimes I can be naive. I just automatically thought that that was what they did, especially when they say, well, we followed the law. And then when the residents kept questioning, would this exacerbate flooding, they would never given a straight answer. And that's when I realized they didn't do it, because had they been done, they would have said, well, we did the flood risk assessment and there was 10% or 20%, but then we have this mitigation plan. And none of that was said, which, had us to know. Again, instead of pulling the community in and having the community to learn more about wetlands and the restoration project itself, they instead, ECHO asked about well, okay, after they went out and they cleared the trees, that's when the residents knew that the restoration was in progress. And it was a clear cutting that you wouldn't believe. And I have pictures to show of what the area looked like during Cristobal. And Cristobal was just a tropical storm, and we were not a direct hit. So it's obvious that if we are ever a direct hit, even from a Category 1, those residents are going to experience flooding. And we asked about the residents allowing, we asked the land trust people who, none of them look like us. They do have, I think maybe one on the board that's, you know, purely token, I'll just say it. And we asked about having some of the residents to come and help as a goodwill gesture, come out and help in the replanting efforts. We were told no, liability and insurance will not allow that. This is a multi-million-dollar land trust. That the Restore Act project was $7.5 million. And, you know, they didn't have money for insurance or liability. They said, well, it wasn't in the grant. I said, well, okay, how much would insurance be for residents to go out and take some time to plant a few trees? ECHO, maybe we can find the funding. They never got back to us. Well, in January, we have, and I wish I could show you this picture of where these students came down from New York to help in the tree planting. And it, you know, to make matters worse, they just threw it in the faces of the residents and showed pictures of them. All white students look like may have been 1 or 2 Asians in the group. Another thing that we're dealing with and we have on appeal is a proposal by the Port of Gulfport to have an inland port, and it's an inland north port, and that is on the site of, it's a contaminated site of a former fertilizer plant, of all things. And so again, now you have the government, this is a military, it's a 24-hour military staging operation in the heart of a residential community. In February, our city proudly announced and had the picture and had all this media event where the Department of Transportation hand delivered a check for $15.7 million for yet another connector road. Now, mind you that the connector road is going to be very near, and it's going to connect to where they're planning on putting this North Port site. And it's kind of like this Turkey Creek thing, to where they're putting this connector road. So you know that this is just a fast track harmful development. And so just these 4 things, that particular case is on appeal. It was permitted with MDEQ over the objections of residents. And we sent out an SOS, Cynthia, like we did for the sign-on, but that time we sent out an SOS appeal for pro bono legal services, and thanks to Anthropocene Alliance, we were able to get experts. That's also from the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice with Dr. Beverly Wright. We were able to get experts, and we were able to get some legal assistance. So that particular case is on appeal. And unfortunately, what I found out wearing my other hat with NAACP is what's happening in North Gulfport, Mississippi is indicative of what is happening across the nation.
Yeah, gosh, thank you, Kathy. Wow, you just went through, wow, I can't even, I was enthralled. Thank you for sharing that with us and the struggle and everything that's going on. And Cynthia, did you have anything to add to that? You just, no? Okay. You're like, no, she said it.
No, that's what I was saying. We've had victories in Turkey Creek, but look what's happening now.
Yeah.
So, and this is a community that has been through so much, but yet look what's happening now. So it's just one of those things. And I'm so pleased that Kathy is laying it all out the way she did, because we still have a lot to do. And the same communities keep getting the same pushback. They're going to try to do everything they want to do. And they're going to fight the community tooth and nail.
Right.
Basically.
Thank you. Thank you. And I want to introduce quick Seema, Professor Seema Kakade, I probably mispronounced it, is from the University of Maryland and the Carey School of Law. She's an assistant professor and director of the Environmental Law Clinic since July of 2017. She has extensive practice in the implementation, enforcement, and compliance of environmental law, and her expertise lies in the areas of air pollution, energy, and climate change. So, Professor, can you tell us more about what the clinic does and how the students are working with, to address NEPA, to address issues through NEPA, especially given what we just heard from Kathy and Cynthia?
Absolutely, Adrienne. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. And it's great to see folks, and it's great to see so many people attending this really, really important panel. I think right now, in particular, for all the reasons that this panel's been discussing, NEPA is so critical. I will tell you that at my clinic, and just so people know, that the University of Maryland has a pretty large clinical law program, and that has students that are in law school get to practice law. They take on pro bono matters as student attorneys under my direction. We have multiple practice areas. We have immigration law, we have criminal defense, we have community economic development, we have a variety of areas of legal practice, and my area is environmental law. And so I've got usually between 10 to 12 law students that work as student attorneys on legal matters on a pro bono basis. And we have more work than we could ever take. The calls are coming in like you wouldn't believe. And I will say that in the last year or so, the calls are coming in particular with respect for help on NEPA. Okay, and it's certainly in multiple different areas that we work in, which is largely Maryland, but we get calls from the entire sort of DMV area. But really communities that need help. Okay, NEPA is easy, as Stephen said earlier. It's a small statute, but it is increasingly complex. And communities are, the public participation process in and of itself can be a tremendous amount of work. So we get calls and fulfill need for communities on the public participation. And that can be anything from understanding what the heck is going on, right? What, is there an EA? Is there an EIS? What's happening? And sometimes there's, activity going on a political front as well, right? There's the legal process, but then there's also activity happening with political representatives. So we do a lot of client counseling, just talking to communities about what the heck is going on, okay? We also do a lot of work on actual public participation when it's appropriate. So helping people think through what they want their oral comments to be, helping people think through what their written comments might want to be, actually drafting written comments on behalf of communities when they need that help. My clinic just conducted a webinar last week, or maybe it was the week before, fairly recently, on how to write NEPA comments, okay? We had about 70 people join that webinar to attend, and that tells you that there is a need, that there are people that want help writing comments. The reason I think that is because some of these documents are incredibly complex, right? It's like, traditional old phone book size, right? They're huge. And just getting through them can be really difficult. And then writing a comment that you feel like is going to be effective, right? That someone's going to actually pay attention to and listen to, can be a real challenge, okay? So we spend a lot of time with folks helping them digest a really large EIS and write comments when we can, okay? Again, I don't have enough students to help with writing comments just on that process because the number of requests are huge, okay? That's just on the public participation part, right? Then right? It keeps going, okay? There's all these offshoot things, and we were sort of talking about it, right? But National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106 consultation, how does that dovetail, right? So we get calls for separate help and separate representation to go through that process, right? So we get these offshoots that sometimes can happen as well for legal work. And then there's, you know, the folks that are calling about an EIS that's done and over with, but they're really concerned because now what? Record of decision, is this project going to get funded? Can we challenge it? Right, particularly if the analysis was incredibly faulty, and I am seeing EISs, you know, forget about the situations, you know, that we were talking about earlier where they're in a categorical exclusion or EA, that's problematic, certainly. But then you get the EISs, right, that are not even done well, okay? And they're not even done well even if they're doing the EIS. And so that is incredibly frustrating, you know, assumptions that are just grounded in nothing, okay? Analysis that really has nothing there. It sort of is just conclusory and there's no expert involved. And so we need to be in a position where we're helping people really think through, okay, is there a good case here? Right, and we're looking at cases like the Dakota pipeline case that was a great win recently, and other cases that we're seeing where we're getting results in NEPA, and those set great precedent for future NEPA cases. Okay, and thinking about pushing forward on NEPA challenges, but that also takes a lot of time, right? You have to think creatively about, you know, a NEPA challenge in conjunction with potentially other legal actions and basis for a lawsuit in the same action. There might be a permitting issue going on, right? We saw the Friends of Buckingham case in the Fourth Circuit in early 2020 that, you know, resounded in NEPA. There was a NEPA process on a compressor station, but really the claims there that pushed forward were on air permits, okay? So sometimes you get these cases where there might be some environmental review being done, but you have to think creatively as well with community groups about where there are other push buttons and where there are other trigger points along the way. And so I'll say, Adrienne, I mean, we're doing a lot of NEPA in my clinic on, you know, from front to end, okay, and everything in between. I'm not even at a position really where I'm thinking about the new federal regulations, because that is a whole separate concern, right? We're up to our eyeballs just in handling existing NEPA issues from the beginning all the way to the end.
Wow, thank you. That is, you know, I'm so glad you mentioned Virginia, the citizens of Buckingham County, because I remember when we did our Human Rights Tribunal, one of the issues was the fact that this ridiculous EIS was poorly done, and they didn't look at the community, of course, as you know, and for people who don't know, is right around the compressor station, right? The community, the Yogaville, and also the previous, the current owners of land that had been previously owned by slave owners. And so we're talking about slave owners as well as land that had been owned by former slaves, right? And Yogaville, but right in the heart of this compressor station, what I like to call in the explosion zone, right? And that the EIS showed, I think, that there was no community located nearby or something to that effect, which was absolutely crazy if you just think about that. So those are things we have to be aware of. But I know that Earthjustice has been working on a lot of these issues around NEPA and the other things, but I have to jump to, because I'm really, you know, really kind of fired up about this. Wanted to talk about the fact that last month, the Environmental Law Institute described the Trump administration's rulemaking around NEPA as possibly the most consequential environmental regulatory action across the federal government. Like and I say, when I think consequential, I think it's the worst thing that could happen for communities. Right, that's my interpretation of it. So I kind of wanted to get everybody's take on that, or if you'd like to jump into that. And I wanted to talk about, I know Seema, you said you really haven't had time because you're inundated with NEPA claims, but it seems like a lot of that might be affected, hopefully not, but by the changes. And I just wanted to see if maybe Stephen could kick us off with some of the changes and the ones that are most, I guess, disturbing for you. I have a few myself, but I don't want us to hog the stage, so. Stephen is like, are you looking at me?
Wait, you said Stephen, not Seema, right?
No, I said Stephen.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah, you know, it's breathtaking how different the NEPA regulations will be under this current rule. There's too many things to go over. You know, we spotted 80 changes when we were going through and writing our comment letter on the proposed rule. Our comment letter was close to 150 pages, or 350 organizations that signed on to it. And, you know, there are some highlights or lowlights depending on how you look at this. But just to name a few, I would start with, you know, some of the redefinitions that go on in the rulemaking, which essentially change what is going to be a significant impact and when is an EIS going to be triggered. The overall effect of the rule is going to be a narrowing of the application of NEPA. And that's going to be through definitional changes. It's going to be through ideas like functional equivalence. You could see land management planning, like how, you know, hundreds of millions of acres of land are managed with oil and gas drilling and things like that, evade any kind of public scrutiny, environmental review, or things like that under NEPA. There are problematic changes in terms of the conflict of interest, which is not something people usually look at and doesn't get a lot of attention, but the conflicts of interest provisions in this rule essentially allow industry or project applicant to write the environmental reviews themselves and do the analysis, which has always been prohibited, and for good reason, because industry obviously operates according to, you know, their stakeholders and shareholders, and they have a fundamentally different responsibility than the federal government, which is to the citizens and the stakeholders and taxpayers. And this is just an enormous red flag and is a potential for enormous abuse, and it's something that should be scrutinized. And then there are issues like cumulative impacts. Cumulative impact analysis has long been required by not only the regulations, but, you know, pre-regulations, pre-1978 when the regulations were issued, it was long in the case law that, you know, cumulative impacts are the fundamental impact that NEPA should be looking at. These are the long-term cumulative effects of things like building out oil and gas pipelines. You know, do you look at it just in the narrow, you know, project-specific site, or do you look at the entire effect of a network of oil and gas pipelines? And what the new rules say is that it's no longer required. Now, that doesn't necessarily prohibit consideration of cumulative impacts, but it certainly opens the door for agencies to ignore it. And that is probably one of the, you know, aside from just avoiding review altogether, when the review is done, if they ignore cumulative impacts, that's going to have enormous consequences on, you know, what people know is going to happen in their community. It's going to have enormous impacts on frontline communities all around the country. I could go on, but I'm curious to hear, you know, what others think in terms of some of the problematic provisions in this new rule.
Yeah, thank you. Kathy, do you want to jump in and share your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I think for this executive order to be signed during and using COVID was probably one of the most egregious and painful situation that we would do this, and especially knowing and looking at the pre-existing illnesses, which, you know, when I first started looking at, even in our state, that it listed the pre-existing illnesses, they were all related to environmental, you know, conditions that you would find. And then now to see the research proving that, and to see this correlation of COVID to pollution, and then this is the worst possible time to, you know, undermine NEPA. And so that was very, very disturbing. And to me, to the point of it should be a human rights violation. I
totally agree. I feel like one of the I wrote about that. I put that blog up there. I also wrote about the issue of what happened in Lake Charles after Hurricane Laura, and the fact that, they were dealing with COVID, hurricane, flooding, and the biolab fire, and the fact that they were sheltering at wherever they were, and they couldn't use air conditioning, couldn't open the windows, couldn't open the doors. So I totally agree. And I think one of my questions was EPA's decision to, withdraw oversight, or whatever you want to call it, was that a contributing factor? We probably will never know, but yeah, so just want to throw that in. Cynthia, do you want to join the conversation on any particular part of the fact that there are even modifications this way, as opposed to what you think may be needed with NEPA?
Well, yeah, I feel like, there's so much across the board that has happened under this administration. So I think my biggest thing is go vote, y'all. We got to vote. We got to vote them out. Don't get discouraged. Don't get upset because somebody just finally figured out he needed to wear a mask. Let's go vote, okay? We got to get those folks out of there. When you have an administrator of EPA who lies to the NEJAC and says, oh, I didn't do this, and did it all, we know we got a problem. Yes, I think a lot of things happened. That whole rollback of not looking at enforcement during all that time happened because of the administrator of EPA. So we are in a really bad time now in terms of this administration not caring about the environment, not caring about climate change. And so we got to get pushing. And I'm so excited about all the legislation that's out there now, the EJ for All Act and all those things, some of the things that some of the states are doing in terms of codifying a lot of good things. I can't even say the right name right now, but y'all know what I'm talking about. Cumulative impacts. So yes, I think that any rollbacks on NEPA are horrible. I think still that NEPA has been a great tool for communities. One thing I meant to mention early on is also, looking back at how our EJ grants were used so many times to do studies that could be used to help impact some of the NEPA impacts and really bring the community more information, a lot of research projects built around NEPA. So I think this whole rollback thing is terrible. I think that we've got to do a lot more in the future to get back to where we were. Like I said, if you have a place like Turkey Creek that has done so much over the years and been such an organized community and really had some great victories around NEPA, to be going over so many issues right now. And I see that in a lot of other places as well. We've got some serious problems.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we all agree. Thank you, Cynthia. I have a, before we get to our final wrap up, well, this may be the final question. So, right now we're in a unique moment in history. We all know that. This has never happened before. We're in the middle of, I like to say syndemic, and I know Vernice is going to take credit. But, so she told me, and, I ran with it. I'm sure we all did. And, Kathy, you kind of touched on this. We have COVID and climate change and all these other things going on at the same time. But and Jacoby, Dr. Wilson said it in a interview with me, that this pandemic has made what was sort of not necessarily hidden, but ignored, more visible, right, for everybody. And so, and it made it clear that our healthcare systems are underprepared to respond to in the face of crisis. So, do you see a role for like how might we change and improve NEPA to offer better protection in the face of the climate crisis? Or do you even see a role for NEPA here? Or have you applied NEPA in terms of climate change, COVID, and just environmental injustice? So let's start with Seema.
I think that's a great question because, how can we improve NEPA? clearly we're going in the opposite direction with this federal regulation. So I think it's a phenomenal question to say, what if in the future, and hopefully, the near future, we have a completely different administration and are able to think through, right, what a completely different NEPA process might look like. What can we imagine? That's what I sort of like to think about, because I do think this idea of NEPA being where it's at right now is ridiculous. And I do think that we need to actually strengthen the existing NEPA. And I think there's a few ways to do that, right? I think that, really harping and honing in on what agencies need to do for climate impact analysis is extremely important. And I think there's a lot that can be done to strengthen that through the NEPA, through individual regulations that happen at the agencies, and through additional guidance that's going on. My feeling, in addition, though, is that we need to go even further back, before we're even at a point in which agencies are doing some kind of analysis. My view is we need to actually impose much more on the project applicants and the project developers to really think about no-build options. And to really think about, to go back and really think about alternatives before we get in to analysis that look at sort of a presumed path forward. I think we need to peel it back way further. And I think we need to require more emphasis on no-build options and alternatives in a way that we haven't done with NEPA at all. We're just in a different place. I think often people think NEPA and they think infrastructure. Isn't that a great thing? They think development. Isn't that a great thing? And to me, the question is always great for whom, okay? And that's, I think, a really important thing to be thinking about is who is it great for? And, while infrastructure and development certainly has a benefit, right? If we don't think about whether we need it in the first place or whether there's an alternative to it, I think we're heading down a path already that can presume that development or infrastructure is going to go forward, and we start to ignore the people that it is not good for. And so my feeling is NEPA needs to be strengthened in a much more robust way and much earlier in the NEPA process than currently exists.
Thank you, Seema. I think that I totally agree with you. Kathy, do you have something I see you can do?
Yes, because I think we all know that it's good for the rich, because in these developments, the rich gets richer and the poor gets poorer. And corporate greed, to me, that's the new Jim Crow. I don't see any difference when we talk about environmental racism and when we look at this and these developments, it's only these more disadvantaged communities where you'll find that they are insistent upon taking advantage of the economic needs and economic desperation, and say that this is going to be job opportunities, or it's going to be economically where we're economically advanced people. But I agree, not only does NEPA need to be strengthened, but when you look at NEPA came about 6 years after the Civil Rights Act. And I think that the Civil Rights Act should be strengthened, to include environmental protections. I don't think that we're going to win this battle unless we have I've called something like an environmental de-escalation plan, as we did the school desegregation, and that's to have community protected. Cities like Gulfport would need to be put under that type of order or that type of mandate before we not see this happening over and over again.
And thank you, Kathy. And I think I see Bernice is here. I just left a wonderful session with her and Marianne Engelman-Lato and others about Title VI and the Civil Rights Act and the need for that to be strengthened. So let me underline what you just said, what everybody said so far. Stephen, would you like to add anything about the issue around NEPA, strengthening NEPA, and this where we are right now?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's interesting, you know, going back to the Civil Rights Act and when NEPA was passed, you know, at the time, there was even talk of making it a constitutional amendment, right to a healthful environment, which you can't even contemplate now in this current environment because, you know, it is so toxic. And like Katherine was saying, you know, we really need a de-escalation to be able to address these issues. But in terms of how to improve it, you know, I think one of the unfortunate, you know, things in history was the courts determining that NEPA is a procedural statute. And that's not the case. I think that was a misreading and that can be corrected. You know, the EIS, or the Environmental Impact Review, was supposed to help achieve the goals laid out in NEPA in Section 101. And I think, you know, down the road in the next administration, maybe there's an opportunity to make sure that the NEPA regulations actually implement the policy goals outlined in the statute itself. And that could be done through executive order, that could be done through regulations, but you know, there are models for this where you have the least harmful environmental alternative requirement, that, you know, you choose the least harmful alternative, whether that's a no action alternative or something else. There are, you know, precedents for that. I think there's also an opportunity in terms of alternatives to provide technical assistance grants to communities to be able to get more involved in the NEPA process, to be developing community offered alternatives that agencies, you know, have to consider. And if they're better for the community, maybe they have to choose those. And I also think, you know, we could start looking more at health impact assessments. You know, states like Alaska do these. They can be rolled into the NEPA process. It helps, you know, avoid disproportionate impacts. It helps put these things on display. I think, you know, similar ideas in the community impact assessment that Representatives McKeechin and Grijalva have put forward in the Environmental Justice for All Act, the community impact reports. I think that would go a long way towards elevating the concerns that are front and foremost to the communities that are, you know, nearest these actions. I think there's a litany of things that can be done, and among those also would be funding the resources, the agencies and the staff to actually do the work of the analysis and to engage with communities. So, you know, I'm optimistic that these things can change and move in the direction that NEPA was originally intended to do, which is, let's, you know, make sure people have a healthful environment. Let's preserve our world and climate for future generations.
Thank you. Thank you. Very well said. So we're almost at time. So quick lightning round. Anything you'd like to share with us? Any information? Any final thoughts? So I think Cynthia said it. Let me just start off with what she said. Vote. I have my ballot here. It's a mail-in ballot. That's what Maryland does. I'll be taking it to the drop-off place just in case, you know, but of course it was to avoid COVID, but I'm willing to don my full ninja outfit for that. So anybody want to have any final thoughts? And let's start with Cynthia. You're on mute.
Okay. Well, you know, again, vote, vote, vote. But I just think that, you know, really dealing with NEPA is a community effort that has to be supported by a lot of people. And I'm so glad to see all of the folks who are here supporting the community. And I just think there needs to be a lot of capacity building as well. So no matter what happens, I think we need to continue to do that. I think the federal agencies, again, I have never figured why EPA is the only federal agency that does grants to communities. I think that's something we need to push more for. So those kind of things are things that I would say as a final comment. Let's keep going, but let's ask for more and more and more to help the frontline communities.
Thank you. Well said. Seema.
Yeah, I think my concluding comment would be to participate, get involved. That's what NEPA is all about. You know, It is, once you're in, it can be very daunting and very frustrating, but it also is a process that helps us learn. It helps us figure out how to hold agencies accountable. It helps us bring us closer to our neighbors and our communities. That's what I really see when I work on NEPA with communities. And so I think my concluding thought would be to participate. And if you need help working through a NEPA process at all, particularly if you're in the Maryland area, give me a call.
Thank you. Very well said. Kathy.
I agree with Cynthia wholeheartedly. I do think all of these issues have been politicized. So the only way that we're going to depoliticize them is to vote. And also want to just thank everyone, because communities feel so all alone when they're confronted with this, and when everyone is having to consistently fight to struggle to ward off these injustices. So thank you so very much.
Thank you. And Stephen, I know you wanted to share some information on NEPA that you were going to be involved in. You're on mute.
Yeah, I can, after 7 months of doing Zoom, I still do this. Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what everybody's saying here. It's just, you know, get involved, stay involved, you know, don't give up hope. And, you know, with regard to the changes that are going on now, there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think there's a lot of confusion on, you know, what's going to happen. And I will make a small pitch that, and I don't have a link yet, but in 2 weeks we will host a webinar that's going to be an open forum. People can submit questions in advance for, you know, if they have questions about the NEPA process in their community, especially in light of the recent regulatory changes. We're going to be doing this in conjunction with several attorneys who I've done these workshops with over the last several years. You can go to protectnepa.org, and next week, hopefully, we'll have a live link up where you can register for the webinar. You can ask questions. It's meant to inform communities on what's happening, how they can stay engaged, and if they have any questions on, you know, how to write comments or, you know, build an administrative record to make sure that, you know, their voice is heard and preserved, that will be available. And like I said, check protectnepa.org, and I'll write that in the chat here next week for a link.
Thank you so much. And I want to just thank all of our panelists. You guys are phenomenal, and you work too hard, all of you, on these issues. But it seems like with the way things have been going in the last 3+ years, we all have to do 3-4 times our job. So congratulations on the work that you're doing, and thank you for sharing it with us. I think we have time for one question. Do we have any questions? Maybe not, because we gave a lot of information. No, yes, no? Okay, so thank everybody for being here. I appreciate it.
Before everyone hops off, thank you again, Adrienne, and thank you again, panelists. I just want to point your attention to the chat where I am posting the link for the main room, and this will be the closeout session for the day. This is the NAACP Climate Justice panel. So if you could make your way over to that room, and we'll get going, I think, around 4:05 for that final session. But thanks again for everyone in this room. This was an incredible panel.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Adrienne.
Thank you.
Thank you,
this was
everybody.
the best panel. We finished on time.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it. Okay, bye-bye.
See you in the main room.
All right. Let me get that.